Welcome, Bruchim Abbaim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. Okay, 2 tidbits to begin our discussion today. They're a little bit provocative. Deep breath. We're going to get through this together and get to the main point. Tidbit number 1 is a story from Jerusalem. When I was a student at Hebrew University, I had 2 roommates, amazing human beings. One came from a modern Orthodox background in the States, another from more of a secular, would go to shul for bar and bat mitzvah and holidays sorts of family. And by the end of that summer, the more secular background Jewish roommate of mine was on the pathway to becoming ultra-Orthodox Haredi. Now, I'm going to leave that alone for how I feel about that, because he's on his own path and he's in his own dialogue with that which is greater than him. But what began that pathway, I think, is critical. The story that he told me was that he was down on Ben Yehuda, main shopping thoroughfare in New City, Jerusalem, and there was a stand, as there often is, from Chabad saying, "Come and lay tefillin." And my roommate was wearing his kippah, and someone from the stand called out and said, "Hey, would you like to wear tefillin?" And my friend went up to the stand and said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what tefillin are." Now, that's fine. There's a lot of choices why one would choose or not choose to interact with various different mitzvot. But in this case, what my roommate said is what he felt. Now, whether he was made to feel that way, I don't know. I only heard my roommate's side of the story. But he felt humiliated, and the word that he used is he felt betrayed, that he had never encountered that. And whose fault is that? Well, that's a completely different discussion. But that feeling that something essential to what it meant to be Jewish, as was explained to him in that moment, was not something that he had had in the past, made him feel betrayed and began a path that led to him. Well, unfortunately, by the time I left Jerusalem that year, he wasn't really talking to his family anymore. So I'm not going to say that this was a positive win. All right, deep breath. That's a difficult story. Let's go into the second one, which is not a story. It's actually a document. And it's what I think the origin is of a lot of the reason that we associate mitzvah A with one group and mitzvah B with a different group. And that is a document called the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. Now, what is that? Well, tiny bit of background. Reform Judaism in America came from Germany. It was transported over from a group of German rabbis who had engaged in what we call Wissenschaft des Judentums. There's some really good videos on it. I'm not going to go into great detail. Essentially, it translates as Judaistic, and what this is saying that Judaism should be subject to the same academic rigor as anything else that we study. When that was transported to the States, we end up with what are called the radical reformers. Not my term. This is the historical term. And the radical reformers did things like get rid of Hebrew in most services and stopped wearing kippot, stopped wearing a tallis. There's still certain shuls in the States that follow that practice. And again, this is not a statement of judgment. That's their own authentic lineage and their own authentic evolution. But what happened at a structural, institutional level was a document that supported that. And it's just better to read the passage that I find the most problematic passage. So here we go. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They failed to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct rather than to further modern spiritual elevation. Now, to be fair, Reform Judaism corrected a lot of what's in that document. And I've never made any secret that I really dislike this document. It's actually been walked back through a series of other documents over the course of 100 years. And there's a newer Pittsburgh Platform from the end of the 20th century that's really worth reading. If you want to know more about it, ask about it. We'll talk about it in a podcast. But part of what this has led to, it still exists, is this idea that mitzvot belong to a certain group. So if I practice a mitzvah, specifically like tefillin, that must mean that I'm Orthodox. And if I don't practice it and I'm still very clearly Jewish, then that must mean I'm Reform, which is incredibly silly. Really, what Reform and Conservative and Orthodox should be about in this situation, yes, I use the word should, is different interpretations of the mitzvot, not saying that one mitzvah belongs to one group versus another group. So a couple problems with this document. One is it's essentially saying, oh, we pity you poor people who still eat kosher and who wear a tallis and tefillin. And it's really mocking the way that Judaism was essentially practiced in Eastern Europe. And if you take a little bit of history back into where Reform came from Germany, there was this constant battle in the 19th century between the Westjuden and Ostjuden. The Westjuden being the much more integrated, much more educated Jews of the West, and then, their idea of the uneducated Jews from the East. It was kind of an inter-Judaism prejudice that was going on, and that carried over to the States. And so any of the remnants of that sort of ritual Judaism were looked upon as backwards, as of the past. But the other aspect of this document, other than being framed incredibly insultingly to anyone who might have had other reasons for following the mitzvot in a fairly frum sort of way, there's also a bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, which is they're looking at the most surface aspect of these various mitzvot. Because from a certain standpoint, they are correct. A lot of our mitzvot did evolve over time as part of a human process. And I don't want to go too much into that. I'm more than happy to. If anyone's curious about that, we're more than happy to talk about that during a podcast. But what that means is the rejection is only of that aspect. But what if the fact that I put on tallis has nothing to do with the original idea of a tallis, which was probably something like tribal differentiation 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, that how do I know that the person coming over the hill is part of my tribe because they wear a four-cornered garment that has fringes on it. That might have been the original, but when I wrap myself in a tallis, it is to elevate that moment, to remind me that in that moment, I am not doing the everyday thing. I'm doing something special. I'm elevating that moment. I'm entering into meditation and prayer. Well, by writing the Pittsburgh platform as it did, it mocked anyone from wearing any of those things for any reasons. And if you go into most Reformed congregations and around the world today, but especially in the States, you'll see people wearing tallis, a tallis. And why? Because most people have found instinctively there's something much deeper than that. Many people have gone through the process of educating themselves and saying there's more to it than just that aspect of it. So that's what this series is about. This series is looking at some of our basic mitzvot and instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, looking at it from various different modalities. And the modalities I'm going to use, hopefully we've heard about before. And that's why I'm doing this introductory video. I'm calling this series the PaRaDiSe of Jewish practice. And PaRaDiSe is in scare quotes there because inside of that is PaRDS, which is Hebrew for orchard. And if that doesn't sound very exciting, orchard was synonymous with a spiritual perfection like the Garden of Eden. And the earliest levels of PaRDS were the esoteric parts of Judaism. But by the time we hit the Middle Ages, this had become an acronym for 4 different modalities by which we can explore Torah. And the way that it was really seen was in the unfolding of the complexity of the eternal, that there were inherently multiple interpretations. So 4 different interpretations of every verse of Torah, and then every word had 70 potential meanings. Now, I'm going to admit, I'm going to deal with these slightly different than is traditionally done because we're in the year 2022 as I'm recording this particular video. So I'm going to explain in the rest of this video what traditionally this acronym means, and then how it's going to function. And then this gives us the opportunity to get ready to jump off and over the next few weeks and months look at these various elements of our practice, not in the surface meaning, not even in the reason maybe we rejected of why we're doing it, but instead looking at what are other possibilities, what are other reasons. For whatever reason today in the year 2022, we're so distracted by so many things, sometimes we need a reason to practice a mitzvah. And if this helps us step into a stronger and more comprehensive practice of our Judaism, if it helps one person do that, then I'm going to be extremely excited. So let's look at PaRDS, okay, right? Showing it on the screen there. So PaRDS, there's Hebrew, there's English, acronym, 4 different letters, Pei, Resh, Dalet, and Samech. And the Hebrew words here are Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. Now, again, this is through the Middle Ages that the current meanings have come to be. If you look further back in Judaism, you'll see other meanings ascribed to them. But pshat essentially means simple or clear. Remez in modern Hebrew means hint. I'll get back to that in a second. Drash means explanation. And then sod means covered, hidden, mysterious. So pshat is so horribly misunderstood. Most people, when they explain this, say that this is the literal meaning. There is no literal meaning of just about anything in Torah, not even for the people who probably wrote and edited the Torah. If you actually want to have some fun, just see why Wikipedia can never be trusted. I just peeked at it out of curiosity before I recorded this video to see what they said. And they say, from the Jewish Encyclopedia, it says that pshat means partially literal. If you then read the Jewish Encyclopedia article, which actually comes from Abraham Geiger, you'll find that that's not at all what the article says whatsoever. It's actually claiming quite the opposite. So yeah, I might actually rewrite that article myself. But what pshat means is, what's the text saying in its intention? Now here's the fun part. How do we know what that intention is? which is why when you read the Pshat explanation from Jewish sages throughout time, they disagree with each other. But it's the clear surface level. What's the text saying? As I look through Jewish practice, how I'm going to interpret this is, what's the mitzvah? How do we know what the mitzvah is? What does our tradition say the standard or most normative halacha is around that? That's how I'm going to interpret that. And if you don't like that as my pshat, then please let me know. I would love to have that discussion with you. So what is the thing itself? What's it saying? Not the literal meaning. Most of Judaism is meant to be non-literal, but what is this pushing us to see directly? All right, remez. This is a little bit more complicated, and I fully admit I use this differently than it's traditionally intended. The meaning traditionally of remez is to hint at something in a very non-linear, non-rational way, outside of how we think. So one of these days I'm going to do an entire video on just Jewish hermeneutics, because we have things like Gazat Hashva, and we have things like gematria. These are tools that are somewhat esoteric and non-rational tools. So gematria, that's assigning numbers to words. Every letter in Hebrew has a numeric value. So if we see that a word has a value of 320, then we can say any other word with the same value has a similar sort of way that we can look at it or interpret it, and that's gematria, and that's traditionally what we meant by remez. When I use remez, I see it as hinting at something archetypal. That is not the traditional way it's used. That's the way I'm going to use it, because I believe that everything that we find in Jewish tradition has an archetypal, universal symbol that's associated with it. So what is the universal symbol for tallis? What are we looking at a universal level? That's what we're going to be looking at. Drash, this one I use in a much more traditional way. This is the allegorical. How do we use something and understand it today? If we were looking at Torah, how do we take a verse from Torah and transport it into today's understanding and language so it makes sense to us? Torah was never meant to exist only in the time and place it was written. It was meant to be universal enough to where we, as time went by, could read something and say, oh my goodness, I still see how that applies to my life today. So that's the drash. That's why we call sermons drashot or a drashah, because it is trying to interpret Torah in a way that makes sense for us today. And then sod, this is the beginning of Kabbalah. This is saying that every verse in Torah also has a hidden or mystical underpinning meaning. Just to illustrate this, before I get into any of the practice, let me go through one of the ways that I traditionally use this. Again, this is not how this is traditionally used, but if I were to then apply these four things to something in the Torah, let's just look at the Garden of Eden story, because I've been playing around with this a little bit in the book that I'm working on. The story at its surface level is trying to provide a myth of origins for humanity. I'm not going to get much deeper into that one because I think what comes later on is more interesting. So we get into the universal symbolic aspect of that. Well, what's the universal symbol? Well, from a universal standpoint, knowledge is difficult. There's a great quote from the play Inherit the Wind, where the character who's supposed to represent the great attorney Clarence Darrow says, sure, you can conquer the skies, but the clouds will smell like gasoline. Right? It's that give and take, that whenever you gain knowledge, then the romance sometimes disappears. And that's part of what Garden of Eden is, right? As long as we have no knowledge, we are walking in perfection with that which is greater than us, with the eternal. And as soon as we gain knowledge, we are cast out of that perfection. This is something that universally symbolically happens to all human beings. All right, let's move it down to drash. How can we understand that today? Well, I'm going to twist it around to how we usually look at that. And let's say we're looking at it from a parent's standpoint, and we see that when someone leaves perfection, they are in pain. So what do parents tend to want to do? They want to protect and then not allow them out of the Garden of Eden. And so how do we do that? We prevent them from having knowledge. Well, what happens? It's inevitable. They must leave the garden. They will be hurt. They will be in pain. So every time that we are trying to hold back the knowledge of the world that's necessary to function, we are making that more painful. I'd say that's about as obvious as an allegory to our issues in society today. And then finally, sod. How do we look at that? I've always taught this differently, but recently I came across something that just blew my mind. One of the most problematic verses for many people in the 21st century in the Garden of Eden is that woman came out of the rib of a man. It's like, oh, okay, that's beginning of patriarchy, right? No. If you look at this from a sod standpoint, it all changes. Because of course the writers of the Torah knew that we all come from woman, right? The birth process in the most literal sense. And so why in the world would we then say woman then comes out of man as some sort of global subjugation? No, this is a mystical statement of the yin and yang. Just picture it. Woman gives birth to man. Now, first of all, you have to actually understand what the Hebrew is saying. The word for man in this passage is Adam. Adam simultaneously has the meaning of the name of a person and all of humanity, male and female. So Adam then gives birth to woman, who then gives birth to Adam once again. And now picture this endless swirling of the generative process. What gives birth to something? When we actually have interaction between opposites, when we encounter that which is different than our understanding. That's sowed. And we can do this with everything that we practice in Judaism. Everything that we do has a multiplicity of potential meanings. And if we say, I don't want to do that because the surface meaning is stupid, we have ignored 75% of the interpretive possibilities. So here's what I'm going to do. This is the end of this video. In the next few weeks, I'm going to do videos on lighting the Shabbos candles. I'm going to do video on leng tefillin, on wearing a tallis. And even though it's not a mitzvah as a traditional mitzvah, one of my dear friends has actually asked for a video on why we wear a kippah. So I'm actually going to take the yarmulke and also put it through this same interpretive rubric and see what happens. Now, that's where I'm planning on leaving it for now. When we get close to Rosh Hashanah, I'll probably do one on Tekiyat Shofar, the blowing of the shofar, etc., etc. If you want something else, you're going to have to let me know, because I would be more than happy to do this video over and over again, because I think that finding meaning in our practice is something that we're lacking. I think there's a bit of a universal reality that when we don't like something, it's because we have listened to a very bad ambassador of that thing. Oh, I don't want to wear tefillin because the only person I've ever seen wearing it was someone who I really despised or represented a version of Judaism that I'm incredibly uncomfortable with. Great, so we've got something that represents putting aspects of eternal reality on our body to symbolically remind us of deeper realities inside of us, and we reject it because we don't like Bob. I think that that's what happens a lot. So let's go ahead and just toss away those sorts of prejudices for a second, and let's re-explore our tradition. I think that a lot of what we have in our everyday practice is exactly what we need. I think that we need to be more aware of such things as where we are in place and time, not what's happening tomorrow, not what I'm worried about that happened yesterday, but centering myself in the moment. Most Jewish practice is exactly doing that. So I'm going to jump into it over the next few weeks. Let me know what other mitzvot you want me to cover. And with that, thank you for being a part of Beit Virtuali. Don't forget to do something that lifts someone up today. And in the process of doing that, we are all lifted up. And with that, I say thank you for being a part of Beit Virtuali. We'll see you next time.
גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד נורא הוא על כל אלוהים כי כל אלוהי העמים